Hi, in this lesson, I want to introduce you to an important component of a computer system called the operating system. Before we get into the details of operating systems, you should know how computer programs run. When a program runs, it essentially performs a simple task. It executes machine instructions. Every second, the process carries out this task millions or even billions of times. It patches an instruction from memory, decode it, so that it figure out what the instruction is, and then execute the instruction. That is, performs the intended operation, such as adding to numbers, accessing memory, evaluating some condition, or jumping to a function, and so on. Once it finishes one instruction, it moves on to the next, repeating this process continuously until the program completes. What we've just described is the foundation of what's known as the von Neumann model of computing. It may sound straightforward, but as we'll explore in this class, there's a lot more happening beneath the surface to ensure the system remains efficient and easy to use. There's a layer of software that's responsible for making it easier to run programs, even giving the impression that you are running multiple programs at the same time. It handles things like allowing programs to share memory and communicate with devices like your keyboard or hard drive, and so other essential tasks. This layer is called the operating system, or OS. Its job is to make sure everything on the system runs correctly, efficiently, in an easy-to-use manner. The primary way the OS does this is through a general technique that we call virtualization. That is, the operating system takes a physical resource such as process, memory, or disk and transforms it into a more general, powerful, and easy-to-use virtual form of itself. So, we sometimes refer to the operating system as a virtual machine. Of course, in order to allow users to tell the OS what to do and thus make use of the features of the virtual machine, such as running a program or allocating memory or accessing a file, the operating system also provides many system calls that are available to applications. Virtualization allows many programs to run sharing the CPU and many programs to concurrently access their own instruction and data sharing memory, and many programs to access devices sharing them. The OS is sometimes known as a resource manager. Each of the CPU, memory, and disk is a resource of the system, so it is the operating system's role to manage those resources efficiently or fairly, or indeed with many other possible goals in mind. This diagram shows the role of the operating system in the overall computer system. The OS has device drivers to communicate with hardware devices, and it also includes the process manager, memory manager, file system, and I/O manager. These components handle virtualization and make sure system resources like the CPU, memory, and I/O devices are managed properly. Thanks to the virtualization, each application sees its own virtual CPU and memory, as if it is the only one using the system resources. Also, applications don't need to deal with the complexities of hard drives directly. They can simply save and load data through an easy-to-use file interface. when an application needs to use system resources, it makes a request to the OS using a system call. And because system calls can get pretty complex, most programs don't use them directly. They go through system library to make things easier. First, to understand the CPU virtualization of the OS, let's take a look at an example. Here, the spin function repeatedly checks the time and returns once it has run for 1 second. The program prints out the string that the user passed in on the command line and calls spin for 1 second delay and repeat forever. Let's say we compile the code and run it on the system with a single process. The system begins running the program. It repeatedly prints the input string passed in. The program will run forever. We can halt the program only by pressing Ctrl+C. Now let's run many different instances of the same program. To run 4 processes at the same time, we can use the ampersand symbol. Doing so runs a job in the background, which means the user is able to immediately issue the next command. Even though there's only one process, all 4 programs seems like they are running at the same time, each printing out their own message. So how is that possible? The operating system creates the illusion that the system has a huge number of virtual CPUs. In other words, it takes a single CPU and makes it looks like there are many CPUs. So multiple programs can appear to be running at the same time. This technique is called the CPU virtualization. But here is a question. What happens if 2 programs want to run at the same time? Which one actually gets to run? That's where the OS steps in as a resource manager. It follows certain rules called policies to decide which program should run and when. Now, let's consider memory. The model of physical memory presented by modern machines is very simple. Memory is just an array of bytes. To read memory, one must specify an address to be able to access the data stored there. To write or update memory, one must also specify the data to be written to the given address. A program keeps all of its data structure in memory and accesses them through various instructions like load or store. Let's take a look at this program. The program first allocates some memory by calling malloc. Then it prints out the address of the memory and then initializes the memory value to 0. Finally, it loops, delaying for a second and incrementing the value stored at the address held in P, variable P. With every print statement, it also prints out the process ID called the PID of the running program. This PID is unique for running process. You can check the output of this program at the right box. The first result isn't all that exciting. The program allocates some memory at the address 0x200000, then slowly update the value and print it out as it runs. Now, let's try running multiple copies of the same program and see what happens. Interestingly, each one allocate memory at the same address, 0x to 0000, but they all seems to be updating that address independently. It's like each program has its own private memory, even though they are technically running on the same machine and using the same physical memory. The OS is virtualizing memory. Each program gets its own private virtual address space, and the OS takes care of mapping and that to the actual physical memory inside the machine. So when one program accesses memory, it doesn't interfere with any other program or even with the operating system itself. From the program's point of view, it feels like it has the whole memory to itself. But in reality, all programs are sharing the same physical memory, and it's the operating system that manages and keeps everything isolated. Another main theme of the operating system is to provide concurrency. The problems of concurrency arise when modern multi-threaded programs work on many things at once in the same program. The operating system itself requires concurrency. As you can see in the examples above on virtualization, the operating system is juggling many things at once, first running one process, then another, and so on forth. So let me demonstrate with an example of a multi-threaded program. Although you might not understand this example fully now, the basic idea is simple. The main program creates two threads using pthread create. The thread runs concurrently while executing the specified routine called worker, in which it simply increments a counter in a loop for loop's number of times. The thread shares the same address space, unlike processes having their own address spaces. Therefore, the global variable loops is shared by the two threads. The right side box shows what happens when we run this program, with the input value for the variable loops set to 1000. The value of loops determines how many times each of the two workers will increment the shared counter in a loop. When the program is run with the value of loops set to 1000, what do you expect the final value of the count to be? As you might expect, when both threads finish, the final value of the count should be 2000, since each thread increments it 1000 times. In fact, if we set the number of loops to n, we would expect the final result to be 2n. But things doesn't always go that smoothly in real life. Let's try running the same program again, but this time with a bigger number, like 100,000 loops. Surprisingly, instead of getting 200,000, we get something like different number, 143,000. Then when we run it again, Not only is the result still wrong, it's also different from the last run. So, what's going on here? This weird behavior has to do with how much instructions are actually executed one at a time. The part of the program where the count gets incremented takes three separated steps. First, load the count value from memory. Second, add 1 to it so it increments the value. The final step is to store the value back into the memory. Since these steps don't happen all at once, they are not atomic. The two threads can interfere with each other during execution of these three instructions. So, how do we fix it? How do we write multi-threaded program that works correctly? The operating system gives us tools called synchronization primitives that let us access the shared variables atomically. That means only one thread can touch the variable at a time. By using these tools properly, we can write multi-threaded program that behave the way we expect. The third big topic in operating systems is persistence. Data in memory doesn't last. Devices like DRAM are volatile, which means once the power goes out or the system crashes, everything in memory is gone. That's why we need both hardware and software that can store data persistently. This kind of storage is super important since users really care about keeping their data safe. On the hardware side, we use input and output devices for operation. In most systems today, that usually means a hard drive, but solid-state drivers, SSDs, are becoming more and more common too, since they are faster and more reliable in many ways. On the software side, the operating system has a component called the file system, which is in charge of managing the disk. Its job is to make sure your files get saved to disk in a way that's both reliable and efficient, so that when you come back later, your data is still there and intact. Unlike what the OS does for the CPU and memory, it doesn't give each program its own private virtual disk. That's because users usually want to share files between programs. For example, say you are writing a C program. First, you use a text editor to write and edit the .c file. Then you run a compiler to turn the source code into an executable. Finally, when you run the compiled program, the system loader will load the executable file to start it. All these steps involve sharing and accessing the same file, not separated copies. On the right side, there's an example of a simple program that creates a file at the directory of temp on the file and write the string hello world into the file. To do this, the program makes three system calls to the operating system. First is open. It opens the file, or it can create a new file if the file doesn't exist. The second one is write. It writes some data into the open file. The last one is close. It closes the file to tell the OS it's done writing. These system calls go through the file system part of the OS. which is responsible for handling file-related operations like this. The file system keeps track of a bunch of data structures to figure out where things should be stored on disk, and it sends I/O request to the actual storage device through something called a device driver. Now, talking directly to I/O devices isn't easy. You should need to know all the low-level details of how the device works and exactly how to interact with it. Luckily, user programs don't have to deal with any of that. Instead, they just use a system call. Behind the scenes, the OS takes care of all the complicated stuff to make the device actually do what you asked. This figure shows how an I/O request from a user program gets handled by the system. When a program wants to do I/O operation, it makes a system call, which hands control over to the OS. The OS then uses a device driver to pass the request down to the hardware device, so it can do the actual work. Since I/O devices are usually much slower than the CPU, the program doesn't just sit there spinning. It goes to sleep and wait. Once the device finishes the I/O operation, it sends an interrupt to the CPU to say, "Hey, I am done." At the time, the OS wakes the program back up and gives it access to the data. If the program was waiting to receive data, the data first gets transferred from the I/O devices into the system memory inside the kernel using DMA. Then it gets copied into the program's user space so the app can actually use it. This figure shows how the hardware components are connected during I/O operations. The CPU sends command to the I/O controller, which is in charge of managing the actual I/O devices. When the device finishes its job, the I/O controller sends an interrupt signal back to the CPU to let it know it's done. The operating system has something called an interrupt handler to deal with these interrupt signals. When an interrupt comes in, the CPU pauses whatever it was doing and runs the interrupt handler to take care of the I/O completion. As for moving data between the I/O device and memory, that's handled by DMA. DMA means direct memory access. This is special hardware. So the CPU doesn't need to get involved. While the DMA transfer is happening, the CPU is free to keep doing other works, which helps improve overall system efficiency. So now you've got a general idea of what an operating system actually does. It takes physical resources like the CPU, memory, and disk, and virtualizes them so that program can use them more easily and safely. It also handles all the tricky stuff that comes with concurrency, like making sure multiple programs or threads don't interfere with each other. And it takes care of storing files persistently, so your data doesn't just disappear when the power goes out. Now, if you are going to build a system like this, we need to have some clear goals in mind. That's why we can make a smart design choice, and just as importantly, the right trade-offs when two goals are incomplete. Knowing how to balance those trade-offs is one of the most important skills in building good systems. One of the most basic goals of an operating system is to create abstraction. So this is to make the system easier and more convenient to use. You don't want every program to deal with low-level hardware details, so the operating system provided simplified and consistent interface instead. Another big goal is to make sure the system runs with high performance. In other words, we wanted to minimize the overhead that comes from adding all these OS features. Things like virtualization and user-friendly design are super useful, but they shouldn't slow everything down too much. So the challenge is to give users these powerful features without adding too much extra cost. This cost or overhead can come in different forms. Maybe it takes more time, like extra CPU instruction executions, or maybe it take up more space in memory or on the disk. So we'll look for ways to keep both of those as low as possible. Another key goal is protection. Making sure programs don't mess with each other or with the operating system itself. Since we often want to run lots of programs at the same time, we needed to make sure that if one crash or misbehavior, it doesn't take down the whole system or affect other programs. That's where the idea of isolation comes in. By keeping processes separated from each other and from the operating system, we can keep things safe and stable. This idea of isolation is at the core of what an operating system is all about. The operating system has to run non-stop. If it crashes, every app running on the system crashes too. Because everything depends on the operating system, it needs to be really reliable. But modern operating systems are super complex, sometimes with millions of lines of code, and making sure they don't break is a serious challenge. There are other important goals too. Energy efficiency matters more and more these days, especially with the push for greener technique. Security, which is really just an extension of protection. Security is also a huge deal, especially now that everything's connected to internet. And as devices get smaller and more mobile, mobility becomes an important consideration too. Depending on the kinds of system you are building, whether it is a laptop or a phone or even a tiny embedded devices, your operating system might have different priorities and be implemented in different ways. But many of the core principles behind how to build an operating system apply across all of these systems. Let me give you a quick overview of how operating systems have evolved over time. In the very beginning, operating systems didn't really do that much. They were mostly just a collection of useful library, like basic tools that programmers could use instead of writing everything from scratch. For example, instead of having every programmer write their own low-level code to handle I/O, the OS would just provide a function for that. It will make easier for developers to make some program. Back then, on those old mainframe computers, only one program would run at a time, and a human operator was the one who controlled what ran and when. This setup was called batch processing. Basically, the operator would load up a bunch of jobs and run them one after another in a batch. A lot of things we expect an operating system today, like choosing which program runs next, were actually done by that human operator. As operating systems evolved, they started doing a lot more than just offering some useful libraries. They became the central pieces that actually managed the whole machine. One important thing was that OS code was treated differently from regular application code because it had control of devices. So the idea of system call was invented. Instead of just calling a function like you would from a library, system calls use special hardware instructions to safely switch into the operating system. These create a more formal, controlled way to go from regular user code into privileged OS code. System call transfers control into the operating system, while simultaneously raising the hardware privilege level. User applications running what is referred to as user mode, which means the hardware restricts what applications can do. Trap raised the privilege level to kernel mode, and the operating system has full access to the hardware of the system. When the system is done servicing the request, it passes control back to the user via a special return from trap instruction, which revert to user mode. Where operating systems really took off was in the era of computing beyond the mainframe, that of the mini computer. Multiprogramming became commonplace due to the desire to make better use of machine resources. Instead of just running one job at a time, the OS would load a number of jobs into the memory and switch rapidly between them, thus improving CPU utilization. So issues such as memory protection became important. Concurrency issues introduced by multiprogramming was also critical. One of the major practical advances of the time was the introduction of the Unix operating system, primarily thanks to Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs. After the mini computer era, came a new kinds of machine, cheaper, faster, and made for everyone. That is called the personal computer or PC. Thanks to early machines like the Apple II and IBM PC, PCs quickly took over the computing world. Why? Because there were affordably enough that instead of sharing one big machine across a whole group, now you could have one computer per person right on your desk. But unfortunately, when it came to operating system, the PC was kind of a step backwards, at least first. A lot of the hard-earned lessons from the mini computer era were either ignored or forgotten. Take DOS, for example. This is Microsoft's early disk operating system. It didn't even bother with memory protection. So any buggy or malicious app could mess up the memory used by other programs or even crash the whole system. And the earlier versions of Mac operating system, like version 9 and before, used the cooperative scheduling, which basically meant that if one program gets stuck in an infinite loop, it could hog the whole CPU and freeze the system, forcing you to reboot. Fortunately, after some years of suffering, the old features of mini computer operating systems started to find their way onto the desktop. For example, Mac operating system 10, that is now called as Mac OS, is built on Unix and include all the advanced features you will expect from a mature, well-designed operating system. Microsoft Windows also made a big stride, especially starting with Windows NT, which was a huge upgrade of the older DOS-based system. A major step forward for Microsoft OS design. Even today's cell phones run operating systems such as Linux that is developed based on the principles and ideas of Unix. It is great to see that the smart design idea from back then have made their way into the systems we use today. And even better, those ideas are still evolving. Modern operating systems keep getting better, offering more features, stronger protections, and making life easier for both users and app developers. This slide shows a brief history of the Unix operating system. Unix was heavily influenced by earlier systems like Multics from MIT. It took a lot of great ideas from those earlier systems and built something that was both simple and powerful. It was especially friendly to programmers. It even came with a compiler for a new program language, C. Being able to easily write shell programs made Unix incredibly popular among developers. The source code for Unix was shared openly, so lots of developers contributed to it and made their own improvement. One famous example is the BSD version of Unix developed at Berkeley under Bill Joy. BSD added a lot of advanced features like better virtual memory, file systems, and networking. By the way, Bill Joy later went on to co-found Sun Microsystems. But things didn't stay that open forever. As Unix became more popular, a bunch of companies tried to take control of it and turn a profit. That led to a bunch of different commercial versions: Sun OS from Sun, AIX from IBM, HP UX from HP, ILX from SCI, and so on. At the same time, there are legal battles over who really owned Unix, especially between AT&T Bell Labs and other players. This created a lot of confusion and slowed down Unix's growth, especially as Windows came on the scene and started dominating the PC market. Luckily, a young Finnish developer named Linus Torvalds decided to build his own version of Unix, one that avoided all the legal issues. That project became Linux. As the internet exploded in the earlier 2000s, companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook started running Linux because it was free, reliable, and easy to customize. Linux also found a home in smartphones through Android, which is based on the Linux kernel. And even on desktop, Unix made a comeback. Steve Jobs brought his Unix-based Next Step system to Apple, which eventually became the foundation for Mac OS. Hi, today's topic is limited direct execution of operating system. Generally, in order to virtualize the CPU, the operating system needed to share the physical CPU among many jobs running at the same time. The basic idea is simple: run one application for a little while, then run another one, and so forth, and application C, and so on. By time sharing the CPU in this manner, virtualization can be achieved. However, there are a few challenges in building such a virtualization, CPU virtualization. The first is performance. How can we implement virtualization without adding some excessive overhead to the system? For performance, the program must be run directly CPU. Okay, so application can be executed directly on the CPU. So we call this technique as direct execution. The second one is control. How can we run process efficiently while retaining control of the CPU? So operating system must control the CPU, but if we give the control to the application, then operating system cannot control the CPU and other resource. Okay? So without control, a process could simply run forever and take over the machine or access information that it should not be allowed to access. So we need limited direct execution technique. Obtaining high performance while maintaining control is one of the central challenges in building an operating system. When the OS wish to start a program running, it creates a process list and allocate some memory and load the program code into memory and locate its entry point such as main function and jump to the main program and start the running user applications. This basic direct execution protocol uses a normal call and return to jump to the program's main and let a gap to the kernel. But this approach gives rise to a few problems in virtualizing the CPU. First, if we just run a program, how can the OS make sure the program don't do anything that we don't want it to do while still running it efficiently? Okay, so application general, if application issue an IO request to the disk or try to gain access to the mobile system resource such as the CPU and memory, the operating system must control the resource access of application. And second problem is how does the OS stop the process from running and switch to another process, thus implementing the time sharing. And without limits on running program, the OS wouldn't be in control of anything, and thus would be just a library. To restrict program operation, we need two different privileged mode of the hardware. So in the user mode, user program can run, so its operation is restricted. Okay, so for example, when running in user mode, a process cannot issue IO request. Doing so would result in the process raising an exception. So if a process try to generate IO request, then in the user mode, the process generate exception, then operating system can gain the control. In the kernel mode, the operating system runs. Okay, and in this mode, code the runs can do what it like, including all privileged operations such as issuing IO requests and executing all types of restricted instructions. So by providing these two different privileged modes, we can restrict the operation of user program that runs in user mode. Okay, so when user program runs in user mode, its operation is restricted, then how a user process can perform some kinds of privileged operations such as reading from disk. To enable this, virtually all modern hardware provide the ability for user programs to perform system call. To execute a system call, a program must execute a special trap instruction. This instruction simultaneously jump into the kernel and raise the privilege level to the kernel mode. User code specify the system call number, and trap table has the jump address for the system call number. So, and once in the kernel, the system can now perform whatever privileged operation, such as accessing storage device or I/O devices, and thus the required work for the calling process can be performed, can be serviced. Okay. So when finished the system call service, the operating system will call a special return from trap instruction. Then it returns into the calling user program while simultaneously reducing the privilege level back to the user mode. So this figure explains the mechanism of the dual mode operation of modern computing architecture. So process provide dual mode, and it allows operating system to protect itself and other system component. So generally, two modes are provided, user mode and kernel mode. Kernel mode is also called as supervised mode or privileged mode. The hardware has a special mode bit to represent the current mode, and some instructions are designated as privileged, so it can be executed only in kernel mode. So to execute a privileged instruction, the hardware mode must be changed to kernel mode. The mode change can occur when a trap or interrupt occurs. So the hardware switch from user mode to the kernel mode. In this figure, so user process is executing. If it calls system call, then trap is generated. Then the hardware mode is changed to kernel mode. Then operating system kernel will be executed, and to service the system call, the request of the user process. Then after handling the system call, it returns to the original user program. Then hardware mode is also changed to user mode, and the user program can be executed. So in the previous slide, I explained when the system mode can be changed. So let's consider the two different mechanisms, two different case that generate the mode change. So interrupt and trap. Interrupt is unexpected external event. So this is external event. So for example, I/O interrupt or clock interrupt. So these are hardware interrupt or console interrupt. Okay. So these hardware devices, these I/O devices can generate interrupt signal to the process. Generally, process has interrupt receive input pin, then I/O devices can send the interrupt request to the process. And machine check interrupt or inter-process communication interrupt also including interrupt. And interrupt can be generated either from hardware or software. Hardware may trigger an interrupt by sending a signal to the CPU. Trap is software-generated interrupt caused by exception or system call. Exception means an error case of the running program. For example, if a program try to execute divide by 0, then hardware generate exception. System call is a specific request from user application, so to get some service from the kernel. So this figure shows the CPU and I/O device operation. So first the CPU is running, and if a process generates a system call for I/O device, then I/O device operation start. Then while handling the I/O service, process can execute other process. Then after, for example, the transfer operation is completed, the I/O device send interrupt signal, then process handle the I/O interrupt. Okay, then it can resume the user application. Then it can generate another system call for the I/O device. Then I/O request operation is performed. After completion of the data handling, it generates interrupt. Then interrupt service is executed. Then after that, CPU can execute the user program. So this slide explains the details of interrupt handling process. So generally interrupt is generated from external source. So process, when interrupt is generated, a process pause current process execution and it jump to the interrupt handler. Generally interrupt handler is located in operating system kernel. Then in the interrupt handler, it checks interrupt source and reason. Then it decides the interrupt service routine. Then it jumps to the interrupt service routine. So operating system can handle proper interrupt. So kernel can intervene whenever interrupt occurs and control interrupt handling and service process request. So this slide also explains the related event or data structure for interrupt handling. So process must receive the interrupt signal from I/O device. Then currently executing process must be stopped. So the current context is saved into kernel memory. So here PCB means process control block. So this data structure has all important information of each process. So currently running process will be, the information of currently running process will be saved into PCB. Then interrupt, the process check the process execute the interrupt handler and it determine the interrupt service routine, then execute the interrupt service routine in the kernel. After handling of interrupt, it can change the process execution. So if process determine to execute new process, here process J, then the PCB of J will be loaded into process. So it can run job J. Okay. So in the system mode, the privileged instruction can be executed. The privileged instruction cannot be executed in user mode. So machine instruction that can be executed only in kernel mode is called as a privileged instruction. For example, some instruction for I/O control, timer management, interrupt management, or switching related to operation and privileged instruction. So this table shows some example of Intel privileged instruction. So you can see several instructions that access important hardware resource of the system. So for example, these registers are related to virtual memory management, and it can these instructions access some special control and debug register. So to access this important system resource, the privileged instruction must be executed, and this privileged instruction cannot be executed at user mode. Okay, so user application cannot execute this privileged instruction. Only kernel can execute the privileged instructions. System call provides the interface between application or process and the operating system. So with the system call, we can use the service provided by operating system. So system calls means for a user program to ask the OS to perform tasks reserved for OS on the user program's behalf. And it also used by a process to request some action by the operating system. So generally, user programs use a high-level application programming interface, that is called as API, rather than the direct system call. So generally, the API is follow the substandard API called POSIX API. So for example, so to access the file data, user application can use the read API. So the application passes some parameter to the operating system. Then actually, so user application calls the standard API function, then that is implemented in user level library. Then the user level library generates the trap to switch to the kernel. Then system call handler find the proper program code to handle the requested system service. Then the corresponding system call code will be executed. Then after handling in the system call, it is returned to the library and user application. To generate a trap, each different process, you provide different instruction to generate a trap. So for example, MIPS architecture provide the syscall instruction. ARM process use SWI instruction. x86 process use interrupt or sysenter instruction. So using these special instruction, we can generate a trap. Okay, so by using different privileged level, so we can implement limited direct execution. So as you can see this example, so let's assume we assume each process has a kernel stack. Okay, kernel stack. So where the registers are saved to and restored from hardware when transitioning into and out of the kernel. So this is example in x86 architecture. So first, the kernel initialize the trap table, and then CPU remember its location for subsequent use. So the kernel does this operation via a privileged instruction. Okay? So from trap table, the hardware can know the jump address for each different system call request or interrupt request. And kernel first set up a few things, for example, so create a process list and memory allocation, and then use return from trap instruction to start the execution of process. This switch the CPU to the user mode and begins this user process. When process wishes to issue a system call, and it trap back to the OS, then OS handle it and once again return the control via return from trap. And the process then completes its work and returns from main. Then this usually will return into some stop code which will properly exit the program. So by calling exit system call, which trap into the OS, at this point the OS cleanup and all the application execution is completed. Okay. So at each trap, process save the user register information to the kernel stack. Okay, because the registers can be used by operating system, so you must remember the saved value of the register. Okay, so the register value can be restored from kernel stack, so before returning to the user application. Okay, so for the trap, it saved the register and it changed the process mode and jump to the trap handler. Okay, and operating system calls return from trap, it restore register and move to the user mode and jump to the user application. So this figure shows the figure explains the system call mechanism. So for example, here user application call the standard API so to print out some message. Then so this printf actually implemented in standard C library. So this library will generate the system call. So it will specify some system call number, okay, for write operation to the console device. Then trap is generated and the system call number is passed. Then based on the system call number, the operating system, the hardware can know what is the corresponding trap handler. Then it jumps to the corresponding trap handler. So here write function. So the after handling the write operation, then it returns to the user application. Okay, so the next problem with the direct execution is achieving a switch between processes. If a process is running on the CPU, this means the OS is not running. So if the OS is not running, how can it do anything at all? So how can the operating system regain control of the CPU so that it can switch between processes? One approach that some systems have taken in the past is known as cooperative approach. In this style, OS trusts the processes of the system to behave reasonably. Processes that run for too long are assumed to periodically give up the CPU so that OS can decide to run some other task. Most processes transfer control of the CPU to the OS quite frequently by making system call. Systems like this often include an explicit yield system call, which does nothing except to transfer control to the operating system so it can run other processes. Thus, in a cooperative scheduling system, the OS regains control of the CPU by waiting for system calls. And this is a passive approach. So what happens if a process ends up in an infinite loop and never makes a system call? What can the OS do then? Okay. How can the OS gain control of the CPU even if processes are not being cooperative? What can the OS do to ensure a dangerous process does not take over the machine? The answer is timer interrupt. A timer device can be programmed to raise an interrupt every so many milliseconds. When the interrupt is raised, the currently running process is halted and pre-configured interrupt handler in the OS runs. At this point, the OS has regained control of the CPU and thus can do what it wants, stop the current process and start a different one. General interrupt handler, the interrupt save the state of the program that was running. Okay, and the addition of a time interrupt gives the OS the ability to run again on a CPU even if processes act in a non-cooperative fashion. Thus, this hardware feature is essential in helping the OS maintain control of the machine. This figure shows the switching between processes via timer interrupt. So there are many running applications. They can interact with the operating system via system call interface, and operating system manage important system hardware resource. And during the execution of application 1, so here application 1 directly run on CPU, so it can be executed by direct execution. So periodically timer interrupt raised, then control is regained by operating system. Then operating system can determine the switching between processes, so it can schedule another application 2. Then during the execution of application 2, there can be a timer interrupt. Then operating system regain the control and it can schedule another process and so on. Okay, now that the OS has regained control, a decision has to be made whether to continue running the currently running processes or switch to a different one. This decision is made by a part of operating system known as process scheduler. And we'll discuss the scheduling policy in the next chapters. If the decision is made to switch, then the OS executes low-level pieces of code, assembly code, which refer to as context switch. The OS has to save a few registers, values for the currently executing process onto the kernel stack, for example, and restore a few register for the soon-to-be executing process from each kernel stack. By doing so, the OS ensures that when the return from trap instruction is finally executed, instead of returning to the process that was running, the system resumes the execution of another process. To save the context of the currently running processes, the OS will execute some low-level assembly code to save all the general purpose registers or program counters and the kernel stack pointers of the currently running process, and then restore, say, the registers and program counter and switch it to the kernel stack for the soon-to-be executing process. By switching stack, the kernel enters the call to the switch code in the context of one process and returns in the context of another. When the OS then finally executes a return from trap instruction, the soon-to-be executing process becomes the currently running process, and thus the context switch is complete. In this example, process A is running, then is interrupted by timer interrupt. The hardware saves each register onto the kernel stack here and enter the kernel, okay, and switching to the kernel mode. So it's a process mode is in the kernel mode. In the timer interrupt handler, the OS decided to switch from running process A to B. At that point, it calls switch routine, which carefully save current register values into the process structure of A that is managed by operating system, and restore the register of process B from its process structure entry, and then switch context. So it switches to the kernel stack of B. Okay. Finally, OS returns from trap, which restore B's registers from kernel stack and start running the process B. And here there are two types of register save and restores that happen during this protocol. The first is when the timer interrupt occurs. In this case, the user register of the running processes are implicitly saved by the hardware. Hardware automatically save the register, so without any software instruction. So the second one is when the OS decide decide to switch from A to B. In this case, the kernel registers are explicitly saved by the OS, but this time into memory in the process structure of the process. The latter action changed the system as if it just trapped into the kernel from B. The context switching include context saving and restoring. The context, the register context of process of the process release the CPU must be saved, and context restoring will reload the register context of process to continue execution. And so context switching include the saving operation and restoring operation. Context switching time can be an overhead. Okay, so generally the more complex the operating system and PCB are, the longer the context switch will be, because more data must be saved into memory. Some hardware, some process support past context switching, so each context switching time is highly dependent on hardware support. So for example, some process provide multiple set of registers. For example, if it has several registers, these registers are used for user program, and these registers are used for kernel. So when this user process is stopped by trap or interrupt, then process only needed to save the user register instead of a kernel, so it can reduce the register saving time. So context switch can be performed by changing only the pointer to the register set. For example, some UltraSPARC or ARM process support this feature. Okay, so this figure shows the example of context switching. Okay, now process P0 is running. So here it can generate system call, or there can be some hardware interrupt. Then control is gained by operating system. So operating system save the state of PCB0. Then OS can decide to execute the process 1. So it reload the state of process 1 from PCB1. Then process 1 can be executed. So if there is some interrupt or system call here, then operating system save the state of the process 1 into the PCB1. And if it schedule the process P0, then it can reload the state of process P0 from PCB0. Then process P0 can be executed. Okay, so we need to consider what happens if during interrupt or trap handling another interrupt occurs. Okay, what happens when during a system call service or timer interrupt. Okay, so what happens when you are handling one interrupt and another one happen? One simple solution is to disable interrupts during interrupt processing. Doing so, we can ensure that when one interrupt is being handled, no other one will be delivered to the CPU. Of course, the OS has to be careful in doing so. Disabling interrupt to long time and could lead to lost interrupt. Operating system also have developed a number of sophisticated approach called locking. Okay, so to protect concurrent access to internal data structure. This enables multiple activities to be ongoing within kernel at the same time, particularly useful on multiprocess. Such locking can be complicated and lead to many interesting and hard to find the bug. So you must be careful when you use locking scheme. Okay, in summary, we have studied some key low-level mechanisms to implement the CPU virtualization and many techniques that can provide a limited direct execution environment. The basic idea is just to run the program to run on the CPU, but first make sure to set up the hardware so as to limit what process can do without OS assistance. Okay, thank you. In this lesson, I will introduce the one of the main features of operating system called the virtual memory. So first, operating system provide a contiguous address space for each process. As you can see this figure, so actually this is virtual view. So operating system virtualize memory space. So operating system can consider the process can consider it has allocated a contiguous memory space, and this space can be used only by the target process. So this address space is actually easy to use abstraction of a physical memory. If you see the real physical memory, so recent computer system support multi-programming. So multiple processes can be executed simultaneously, so they will share the physical memory device. So some reason is used for process C, some reason is used for process B, but each process can consider it has its own private contiguous memory space. This is virtualized memory view. So this is the learning programs view of memory, but in real system, operating system build this abstraction of private and potentially large address space for multiple learning processes. They share the physical memory on top of a single physical memory. So early days, early machines used only a single application. So one application can use whole physical memory space, but recent computer systems support multiple programming. So multiple processes can be executed simultaneously. So they must share the physical memory. But application programmer can consider only this virtual view of the memory. So the programming is very easy. So this code can provide the allocated memory space for each application. So in this main function, if you check the address of this code, program code, then you can find the location of a program code. And when you allocate memory space from heap area, then you can check the heap address. And generally the local variable is allocated at the stack memory. So if you allocate a local integer variable, and if you print out the address of the variable, then you can check the stack memory address. But this address value is virtual address, so program access this virtual address, but this is not physical memory address. Okay, so let's see several different memory regions in the address space. So first, stack memory is allocated and deallocated implicitly by the compiler. When compiler generates some code of the program, so it automatically generated the memory space per stack in compile time. So this memory region is called as automatic memory. Then compiler makes space on the stack when you call the sum function. So when some program code enter into function, so it must allocate the stack memory for the function. So the compiler generated the code to increase the stack pointer. So the stack memory is allocated at the compile time. When returning, when the application returns from the function, the compiler will deallocate the memory. So the variable declared in the function is a local variable. So this local variable use some memory during the execution of the function, but when after the function call, then the local memory space is freed. Heap memory area is used to allocate some variable dynamically. Okay, so the heap memory is allocated by programmer by calling the malloc or free API. As you can see this figure, so by using malloc API, programmer can dynamically allocate and deallocate the memory space. So, but the address for the heap memory itself is stored on the stack. So when we allocate stack memory for this function, the address for this variable is stored into the stack memory, but real space for the data is allocated in the heap area. So, as I explained, so each application has its address space, address view, and some region so is allocated for operating system kernel. Then the remaining region is used for applications. So there are text region and data region, BSS region. So this is used for program code. Okay, your program code will be loaded into this memory region, and the static data of your program. Your program includes some static data. If you declare some variable as some global static variable, and you initialize the variable data, then the data is loaded into data region. BSS is used for variable to be zero initialized in your program. If you simply declare integer X array, then the memory space for this X array is allocated at this BSS region, and its value is zero initialized. And here is the stack memory area and heap memory area. And if you call the mmap API, then anonymous memory region can be allocated. So I will explain what is mmap at the next chapter. So this mmap region is used for anonymous memory region. So that means the region is not associated with any particular file, but rather with the swap space. So if this memory is evicted from physical memory, it is returned to a swap area. So when you call mmap, the memory space is allocated to this region. Okay, so operating system provides a special system call called BRK as BRK. It changes the location of program's break. So here the break means the end point of heap area. So the heap region is from start BRK and end BRK. So by using BRK or SBRK API, you can change the end point of heap region. Okay. Okay, so now let's consider several problems with the memory, so especially when operating system does not support the virtual memory. So that means it does not support the address translation between virtual address to physical address, and the memory space for each process is allocated at the contiguous memory area. So we can consider 3 problems, then the virtual memory system can provide some solution for these problems. First problem is not enough space. For example, so if we use RISC 32-bit architecture, so 32-bit architecture can access the 32-bit address space. That means because the address can be represented using 32-bit, so the total size of accessible memory space is 4 GB. So program generate 4 GB program generate the address to the 4 GB space. Okay, but real memory will have a smaller size. Okay, so for example here only we have 1 GB memory. Then if a program access this address, then we can access the real memory data. But if we try to access this memory, so then there is no mapped real memory, so the program will crash. Okay, so this means the real memory can be smaller than the full address space. Next problem is holes in the address space. For example, let's assume so we have a 4 GB real memory and we try to execute 3 programs, program 1 and 2, 3. So program 1 require 1 GB memory space, program 2 require 2 GB, and program 3 also will use 2 GB memory space. If we run program 1 and 2, program 1 will use this memory space and program 2 will use this memory space. Okay, so in total the 3 GB of memory is used and we have 1 GB free space. If program 1 finish, then we have 1 GB free memory and 1 GB free memory. So we have now 2 GB free memory space, and program 3 is require 2 GB. So we can consider that we can run the program 3 because it requires 2 GB memory space and we have 2 GB free space, but we cannot allocate the memory for program 3 because memory is fragmented. Okay, so the free memory space is separated. Okay, so we cannot run program 3 even though there is enough space. This problem is called as memory hole problem. Okay, so next problem is protection between programs. Each program can access any 32-bit memory address. So what if multiple programs access the same address? In this example, we have the program 1 and 2, and we have memory 4 GB. If program 1 store your bank account balance, so this is very important data at the address 1024, then this memory value is saved here. If program 2 store your video game score at the same address 120 or 1024, then the data is updated. So these multiple programs can corrupt or crash each other, so by accessing the data of other program. So this is the protection problem. Okay, so in summary, if all programs have access to the same 32-bit address space, they can crash if there is less than 4 GB of memory. So if the physical memory is smaller than the 4 GB, then when program generate some arbitrary address, they can make some crash. And another problem is if we run multiple programs, so then even though there is a free space, we cannot allocate the free memory for some program. So this is the memory hole problem. And so the problem was the protection. Okay, so some program can collect other programs' data. Then how we can solve this problem? Okay, so the solution is to give each program its own virtual address space. That means each program cannot directly access physical memory address. So it first generates the virtual address, then the virtual address is translated into real physical address value. Okay, so virtual memory provide the memory indirection. So it take the program address. Actually, the program address is a virtual address. Program generate virtual memory address during the execution. Then the virtual memory address is mapped to the real physical memory address using this virtual memory system. So this figure compare when we don't use the virtual memory technique and the virtual memory technique. So without virtual memory support, the program the address generated by program is the same to the real memory target address. So if some program try to this memory address, then the is not mapped to real physical memory, so that is crash. But in the virtual memory technique, program's virtual address is mapped to RAM address by a virtual memory scheme with the support of operating system. So for example here, memory address 0 is mapped to physical memory 1, and virtual memory address 1 is mapped to physical memory address 0. Virtual memory address 2 is mapped to physical memory 2. Then physical virtual address 3 it cannot be allocated to physical memory address because the physical memory size is smaller than the 4 GB. So in this case, this memory space is mapped to a storage device. So using storage device, we can make virtually large memory space. So using virtual memory technique, we can solve this problem, not enough memory problem. Because the virtual memory map program address space to the physical memory or disk. So by allocating some address space to the disk, we can provide virtually large memory space. For example, if a program access address 0, so it is mapped to physical memory. Address 1 is mapped to physical memory. Address 2 also mapped to physical memory. But if a program make some data at address 3, so we cannot allocate the physical memory. Okay, so there is no free space here. So the memory is mapped to disk. Okay. Then if a program try to access the address 3, the data cannot be directly accessed because of the data in the storage device. So the data must be moved. This data must be moved to the physical memory. So virtual memory system move out least recently accessed data and bring in the address 3 from disk. So we remove the data here, for example, then program 3, address 3 is the data for address 3 is moved from disk to this memory location first. Then this data, this memory address will be mapped to disk. So the original data in the physical memory 1 was saved into disk. Okay. So by swapping the data in the memory to the disk, then we can make a free space. Then the new accessed data can be loaded into memory. Okay, then because virtual memory system utilize the disk as a extended memory space, it affect on performance. Okay, so if the accessed data in the disk, not in main memory, there is a performance degradation because the reading from disk is much slower than reading from memory. So anytime you cannot fit your data in memory, then we have to access the disk, and you must pay a huge performance penalty. So we need more memory actually to make your computer faster. So then virtual memory, how to solve the second problem, the memory hole problem. Okay, so in this example, program 2 use this memory space. So we have the free space, 2 GB free space, but they are fragmented. So when we want to load the program 3 to the physical memory, virtual memory will map the virtual address to the physical address. So program 2, the logical virtual address space of program 2 is mapped to here. Okay. But program 3 memory is allocated from first 1 GB free space and second 1 GB free space by supporting the mapping technique. So contiguous virtual address space can be allocated on separated physical memory space because we use memory mapping technique in the virtual memory scheme. So we can solve the memory hole problem. So that means we don't need any contiguous free space to allocate some contiguous virtual memory address. So each program has its own mapping, and the mapping allow put our program data wherever we want to in memory. Okay. So then, how to solve the third problem? Okay, so protection problem. So if program 1 and 2 address space map to different RAM address, then we can provide protection. So because each program has its own address space, then we can separate the physical memory space for different program. For example, if program 1 store some data at the address 1024, then virtual memory map the address to here, so the data is written here. If program 2 store some data at the same address, so actually this address is a virtual memory address. Okay, so this is virtual. So then, because this program 2 use its own mapping technique, this virtual address can be mapped to other physical memory location. So this data can be written here. So then we can provide some protection because neither program can touch the other's data. Okay, some case we want to make different programs share a lot of data. For example, the library code can be shared between programs. Then virtual memory technique enables us to easily share data while protecting private data. So in this example, okay, so these private data is located at a different physical memory address, but this memory can be shared between two programs. So shared data can be allocated to this memory space, and program 1 mapping and program 2 mapping point to same memory location. So operating system must provide memory virtualization. So there are several goals of memory virtualization. First is transparency. So that means program shouldn't be aware of the fact the memory is virtualized. Okay, so program only access its virtual memory space. It does not need to consider the physical reality. Okay, so program behavior as if it has its own physical, private physical memory, and OS does all this virtualization work to multiplex memory among many different jobs, and hence implement the illusion of virtualization. Okay? So as I explained in the previous slide, each process consider only its virtual memory space, so it accesses this virtual address, but operating system translate the address into the physical memory address. Okay. So to implement virtualization, memory virtualization, the efficiency is also very important. Okay. So you need to consider first the time and overhead for the memory virtualization. So due to the memory translation, the program must not run much more slowly. Okay, so modern computer systems support hardware support called TLB. TLB means the translation logoed buffer. So at a computer architecture class, maybe you studied what is TLB. So TLB generally caches the translation entry. So using this hardware component, the address translation can be performed fastly without long latency. So, and the next, space efficiency must be considered. Okay, so too much memory for translation structure cannot be used for memory virtualization, so we must optimize the memory space to support the memory virtualization. Generally for address translation, operating system must manage some mapping table, translation table. It can translate for a virtual address. It can provide the physical address value. So it must maintain this table. So this table will occupy some memory space. Okay, so this space overhead also must be considered. This table must not too large. The next goal is protection. Okay, so operating system protect processes from another as well as operating system itself. Okay, so that means if this is a physical memory space, some region is reserved for operating system. So operating system, only operating system can access this region, and this region can be allocated for process 1. This region is allocated for process 2. Then each user process cannot access the memory space allocated for operating system. In addition, other process cannot access other process memory space. This is not permitted. Okay, so this feature is called as protection. Okay, so memory virtualization must provide this protection technique, and by using with the protection, we can deliver the property of memory isolation. Okay, so one process cannot access the memory space of another.